I held the phone in my hand, reading those words again and again until they burned into my memory. "You're not invited, Mom." My daughter's message was brief, cold, final. 3 weeks later, I saw the photographs on social media. Her wedding day, radiant in white lace, wearing the dress I had spent 6 months sewing in the dim light of my bedroom while she thought I was asleep. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. Before we begin, I'd be truly grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me keep sharing these stories with those who need them most. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. I live in a small apartment in Brooklyn, New York, where the autumn leaves now scatter across cracked sidewalks and the neighborhood bakery still smells like the cinnamon rolls I used to buy for my children every Sunday morning. The apartment isn't much. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen with yellowing tiles, and a living room where sunlight filters through lace curtains I embroidered myself 40 years ago. Every morning, I wake at 5:30 to the sound of garbage trucks rumbling past, make instant coffee because the good kind costs too much, and sit at my kitchen table staring at my phone, waiting for messages that rarely come. The apartment tells the story of my life in ways words cannot. The kitchen table, scarred with decades of homework sessions and family dinners, wobbles slightly on one leg. Tom promised to fix it the week before he died, and I never had the heart to do it myself. The refrigerator hums too loudly, a mechanical wheeze that sounds almost alive in the pre-dawn silence. I've learned its rhythms, its moods, the way it shudders before the compressor kicks in. Some mornings, I open it just to feel the cool air on my face, to look at the nearly empty shelves and remind myself that I'm still here, still surviving. There's usually a carton of milk, some eggs, bread from the discount rack at the grocery store, and leftovers from whatever I managed to cook earlier in the week. Clara says I should eat better, that I deserve fresh vegetables and good meat. But old habits die hard. When you've spent 50 years calculating every penny, luxury feels like betrayal. The living room is my sanctuary and my prison. The couch, a faded floral pattern from the 1980s, still bears the indentations where Tom used to sit, reading his newspaper and drinking his morning coffee. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in his spot and try to remember the weight of his presence, the sound of his voice, the way he used to hum tunelessly while reading the sports section. The memories are fading, blurring at the edges like old photographs left too long in the sun. I'm terrified that one day I'll wake up and won't remember his face at all. So I hold on to these small rituals, sitting in his spot, touching the worn armrest, closing my eyes and breathing in the ghost of his aftershave that I swear I can still smell, even though it's been 15 years. The walls are covered with photographs, a gallery of a life that no longer exists. Sarah's school pictures year by year, showing the transformation from a gap-toothed child with wild curls to a polished teenager with straightened hair and practiced smiles. Michael's graduation photo, him looking uncomfortable in his cap and gown, already eager to shed the ceremony and get to the party. Tom and me on our wedding day, both of us impossibly young, laughing at something the photographer said. Family vacations to the Jersey Shore. Rare indulgences where we'd pack sandwiches and spend the entire day on the beach because we couldn't afford to eat at restaurants. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, Halloween costumes I made by hand because store-bought was too expensive. Every photograph is a reminder of how hard I tried, how much I loved, how little it mattered in the end. For 30 years, this was my routine. Wake early, prepare breakfast for my family, work a double shift at the hospital as a nursing assistant, come home exhausted to cook dinner, help with homework, mend clothes, pay bills I could barely afford. My late husband Tom died 15 years ago from a heart attack, leaving me with 2 children to raise alone. Sarah, now 35, and Michael, 32. I worked myself to the bone to give them everything. I sold my mother's jewelry to pay for Sarah's college tuition. I took out loans I'm still repaying to cover Michael's failed business ventures. I forgave Sarah when she stole $3,000 from my savings account to buy a designer handbag, telling myself she was young and would learn. I forgave Michael when he crashed my car and never offered to help repair it, convincing myself that sons sometimes forget to show gratitude. The hospital became my second home, or perhaps my first. The apartment was where I slept and worried, but the hospital was where I existed. I knew every hallway, every supply closet, every temperamental piece of equipment. I knew which doctors were kind and which ones screamed at nurses. I knew which patients needed an extra blanket, which ones just wanted someone to hold their hand, which ones were dying and knew it but couldn't say the words. I was good at my job, excellent even. My supervisor told me countless times that I should have been a nurse, that I had the skills and the temperament, but nursing school required time and money I didn't have. So I remained an assistant, doing the work that kept hospitals running, the invisible labor that everyone relies on, but no one notices. The double shifts were brutal. I'd work from 7 in the morning until 11 at night, sometimes 3 or 4 days in a row, surviving on vending machine coffee and whatever patients didn't finish from their meal trays. My feet would swell so badly that I couldn't get my shoes off without help. My back ached constantly, a dull throb that became the background music of my life. I developed carpal tunnel syndrome from lifting patients, arthritis in my knees from standing on hard floors. My body was breaking down, sacrificed piece by piece to pay for my children's dreams. But I told myself it was worth it. I told myself that one day they'd understand what I'd given up for them. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, and I was proving my love with every aching step, every exhausted breath. But something shifted 6 months ago. Sarah called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I'm getting married. James finally proposed." James was her boyfriend of 2 years, a stockbroker from Manhattan who drove a Tesla and never once acknowledged my presence when he visited. I felt my heart swell with joy despite my exhaustion from a 12-hour shift. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. When is the wedding? What can I do to help?" There was a pause on the line, a hesitation that made my stomach tighten. "We're still figuring out the details, Mom. I'll let you know." Then she changed the subject to complain about her job, and I listened as I always did, making sympathetic sounds while my feet throbbed from standing all day. I remember that phone call with painful clarity. I had just walked in the door, still wearing my scrubs, my body screaming for rest. But when I saw Sarah's name on my phone screen, I ignored my exhaustion and answered with manufactured enthusiasm. She didn't ask how I was, didn't ask about my day, didn't notice the weariness in my voice. She launched immediately into her news, her excitement filling the space where concern might have lived. I tried to share her joy, tried to imagine the wedding, tried to picture myself there, helping her dress, fixing her hair, standing beside her as she started this new chapter. But even then, in that initial moment of celebration, I felt something cold creeping in. The hesitation when I offered to help, the quick subject change, the subtle message that my involvement wasn't desired, just tolerated. After the call ended, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, phone still in my hand, trying to understand the unease crawling through my chest. I should have been ecstatic. My daughter was getting married, starting a family, building a life. Wasn't that what every mother wanted? But the joy felt hollow, performative, like I was reading lines from a script I didn't quite understand. I made myself a cup of instant coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding for years. My daughter didn't really want me in her life. She called when she needed something, money, advice, someone to listen to her complaints. But she didn't call because she loved me, because she missed me, because she valued my presence. I was a resource, not a person. A utility, not a mother. Weeks passed. I texted Sarah several times asking about wedding plans, offering to help with anything she needed. The responses were brief and vague. Still planning. Super busy. Talk later. I told myself she was overwhelmed with preparations, that she would involve me when the time was right. Then, one evening, while visiting my neighbor Clara for tea, I saw photographs on Facebook. Sarah had posted pictures from her bridal shower, a lavish event at a rooftop restaurant in Manhattan with champagne towers and designer gift bags. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even told it was happening. Clara squeezed my hand as tears streamed down my face, but she said nothing because there was nothing to say. Clara and I had been neighbors for 20 years, ever since she moved into the apartment across the hall after her husband died. We bonded over widowhood, over the peculiar loneliness of sleeping in a bed meant for two, over the exhaustion of being solely responsible for everything. Clara had been a teacher before retirement, and her apartment reflected her love of books and learning. Every wall was lined with shelves, and the smell of paper and tea was a comforting constant. Our Tuesday evening tea ritual had begun almost by accident. I had locked myself out of my apartment, and Clara had invited me in to wait for the super. We started talking and didn't stop for 3 hours. After that, Tuesday evenings became sacred. We'd sit in her book-filled living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups she'd inherited from her mother, and talk about everything. Our dead husbands, our difficult children, our dreams and regrets and fears. Clara never had children, a choice she made deliberately and never regretted. I was a teacher, she told me once. I had hundreds of children. That was enough. She watched my relationship with Sarah and Michael with a clear-eyed perspective I lacked, seeing patterns I was too close to recognize. She never judged me for the sacrifices I made, but she questioned them, gently pushing me to examine why I gave so much to people who gave so little back. "Margaret," she said more than once, "love shouldn't leave you empty. Love should fill you up, even when it's hard. If you're constantly depleted, constantly exhausted, constantly wondering if you're enough, that's not love. That's exploitation." I always defended my children when she said things like this, insisting she didn't understand, that motherhood was different, that sacrifice was part of the job. But her words planted seeds that would eventually grow into the courage I needed to change my life. That evening, seeing the bridal shower photos on Clara's iPad, I felt something crack inside me. Clara didn't say, "I told you so," though she could have. Instead, she got up, made us fresh tea, and said, "Tell me what you're feeling." And I did. I told her about the years of feeling invisible, of being needed but not wanted, of giving everything and receiving so little. I told her about the sick feeling in my stomach every time I called Sarah, the bracing myself for disappointment, the constant calculation of how to phrase things so I wouldn't annoy her. I told her about the shame I felt, not shame at Sarah's behavior, but shame at my own neediness, at wanting so desperately to be included, to be loved, to matter. Clara listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something that changed my perspective forever. "Margaret, you're not needy. You're a human being with normal emotional needs. Wanting your daughter to include you in her wedding celebrations isn't asking too much. It's asking for the bare minimum. And the fact that you think it's too much tells me everything about how they've trained you to minimize your own worth." I confronted Sarah the next day, my voice shaking as I called her during my lunch break. "Sweetheart, I saw the photos from your bridal shower. Why wasn't I invited?" She sighed, that particular sigh children use when they find their parents tiresome. "Mom, it was just a small thing with my friends. You wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway. It was very upscale. Lots of people you don't know." Upscale. As if I was too poor, too embarrassing, too unworthy to be seen with her successful friends. "But I'm your mother," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I would have loved to be there." Another sigh. "Look, Mom, I have to go. I have a meeting. We'll talk later." She hung up before I could respond. I was standing in the hospital break room when we had that conversation, surrounded by other nursing assistants eating packed lunches and complaining about difficult patients. I must have looked devastated because Maria, one of my coworkers, asked if I was okay. I mumbled something about family problems and excused myself, walking quickly to the bathroom where I locked myself in a stall and cried silently, a skill I'd perfected over years of hiding my pain. When I finally emerged, my face red and swollen, I saw myself in the mirror and felt a wave of self-loathing. I looked pathetic. I looked like exactly what I was, a desperate mother begging for crumbs of affection from a daughter who found her embarrassing. The word upscale kept echoing in my mind. Too poor, too simple, too working class, not good enough to be seen with her successful friends. The daughter I had sacrificed everything for was ashamed of me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to sirens wail through the Brooklyn streets, feeling something hard and cold forming in my chest. I got up and walked to my closet, pulling out the box where I kept old photographs. There we were, Sarah as a baby, me holding her in the hospital with Tom beside us, both of us glowing with love and hope. Sarah's first day of school, wearing the dress I had sewn by hand because we couldn't afford store-bought clothes. Sarah's high school graduation, standing between Michael and me, her arm around my shoulder, smiling genuinely. When did that girl disappear? When did I become someone to hide, to exclude, to tolerate rather than love? I spread the photographs across my bed, a timeline of devotion and gradual disappointment. There was Sarah at 5, holding the doll I'd saved for months to buy, her face incandescent with joy. Sarah at 10, winning the school spelling bee, looking for me in the audience, her smile widening when she found me. Sarah at 13, sullen and distant, the beginning of the transformation I told myself was normal teenage rebellion. Sarah at 16, asking for money for a school trip, barely making eye contact, treating me like an ATM. Sarah at 20, calling only when she needed something, her conversations peppered with complaints about her life and silence about mine. The progression was clear when laid out like this, a slow erosion of connection that I had refused to see because seeing it would have meant acknowledging failure. I remembered the years after Tom died, how I worked doubles and sometimes triples at the hospital to keep the apartment, to pay for their college, to make sure they never felt the poverty that gnawed at my bones. I remembered skipping meals so they could eat, wearing the same coat for 10 winters while they got new ones, lying awake at night calculating whether I could afford their textbooks and still pay the electric bill. I remembered Michael's gambling debts that I covered with money borrowed from loan sharks, money I'm still repaying at 72. I remembered Sarah's shopping addictions, her maxed-out credit cards that somehow became my responsibility. I forgave everything, justified everything, because that's what mothers do. But as I sat there at 3 a.m, holding photographs of children who no longer existed, I wondered if I had been a mother or a servant, a parent, or a bank account. Tom's death had shattered me in ways I still haven't fully processed. He died suddenly. We were eating dinner, laughing about something silly, and then he grabbed his chest and collapsed. I called 911, performed CPR the way I'd been trained at work, begged him to hold on. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Massive heart attack, they said. Nothing anyone could have done. He was 47 years old. Sarah was 20, Michael 17. I was 57, and suddenly I was alone, responsible for everything, drowning in grief and terror and bills I couldn't pay. Tom had life insurance, but it barely covered the funeral. He had debts I didn't know about, credit cards, personal loans, money borrowed from friends. I discovered after he died that we were on the verge of financial collapse, and he had hidden it from me, trying to fix it himself, the weight of it stopping his heart. After Tom's funeral, I didn't have time to grieve properly. I had to figure out how to survive, how to keep the apartment, how to pay for Michael's last year of high school, and Sarah's college tuition. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, sometimes working 20-hour days, coming home to collapse for a few hours before starting again. I stopped buying anything unnecessary. No new clothes, no entertainment, no treats of any kind. I ate whatever was cheapest, mostly rice and beans and whatever marked-down produce I could find. I lost 20 pounds in 3 months. Not from intentional dieting, but from stress and deprivation. My coworkers noticed, expressed concern, but I brushed it off. I'm fine, I'd say. Just adjusting. But I wasn't fine. I was barely surviving, held together by determination and the belief that my sacrifice would mean something, that my children would appreciate what I was doing, that love would be enough. The wedding invitation arrived 3 weeks later. Not in the mail, but as a text message. A screenshot of a sleek black and white card with elegant calligraphy announcing Sarah's marriage to James at a boutique hotel in Manhattan. At the bottom, in smaller text, "Intimate ceremony, immediate family only." I stared at those words for a long time. Immediate family only. What did that make me? I texted back immediately, my fingers trembling. "Sweetheart, when is the ceremony? What should I wear? I'd love to help with anything you need." The response came an hour later. "Mom, I need to be honest with you. The wedding is very small, and we've decided to keep it to just a few people. You're not invited. I hope you understand. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. I read those words again and again until they blurred. How could excluding your own mother from your wedding be nothing personal? I called her, but she didn't answer. I called Michael, thinking perhaps he could explain, could mediate, could make sense of this. He answered on the 5th ring, sounding annoyed. "What is it, Mom? I'm at the gym." I told him about Sarah's message, my voice breaking. He was silent for a moment, then spoke in that tone people use when explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Mom, Sarah's wedding is her choice. If she wants it small, that's her right. You need to respect that. Besides, you'd probably feel out of place anyway. It's going to be very fancy, lots of important people, investors and executives. You know how you get uncomfortable in those situations." I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the world tilt. How I get uncomfortable. As if my discomfort was the problem, not their cruelty. As if being excluded from my own daughter's wedding was a favor to spare me awkwardness. "Michael, I'm her mother. I raised her. I gave up everything for her, for both of you. How can she not want me there?" He sighed, the same sigh Sarah had used. "Mom, you're being dramatic. It's just a wedding. Get over it. Listen, I have to go. My trainer is waiting." He hung up. The silence after he hung up was deafening. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to dead air, unable to process what had just happened. My son, the boy I had raised, fed, clothed, sacrificed for, had just told me to get over being excluded from my daughter's wedding. As if it were a minor inconvenience, a trivial disappointment, something easily dismissed. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I sank into a chair, the phone sliding from my hand, and for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. My children don't love me. Not really. They love what I provide, what I do for them, the role I play as their mother. But me, Margaret, the person behind the role, they don't know her, don't care to know her, might not even like her if they did. I sank into a chair, the phone sliding from my hand. Just a wedding. As if a wedding was just a party, just an event, not a milestone. Not a moment when a mother should stand beside her daughter and feel the bittersweet joy of watching her child begin a new life. I thought of all the times I had imagined this day, helping Sarah choose her dress, fixing her veil, holding her hand before she walked down the aisle, dancing with her at the reception. I had dreamed of this day since she was born, and now I was being told it was nothing personal. For 3 days, I barely ate or slept. I went through the motions at work, changing bedpans and checking vitals, smiling automatically at patients while my heart shattered in my chest. Clara noticed, of course. She always noticed. On the 4th day, she appeared at my door with a casserole and a determined expression. "Margaret, sit down. We need to talk." She placed the casserole in my refrigerator and made tea, the ritual we had shared for 20 years. "You need to stop letting them do this to you," she said gently, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "You've given them everything, and they treat you like you're nothing. When are you going to see your own worth?" I wanted to defend them, to make excuses, but the words stuck in my throat. Clara reached across the table and took my hand. "You're a good woman, Margaret. You're kind and generous and loving. But they're taking advantage of that. They know you'll always forgive, always give, always sacrifice. And they're bleeding you dry, not just financially, but emotionally. You're disappearing and they don't even notice." Her words pierced through the fog of my pain. Was I disappearing? I looked at myself in the mirror that night and saw a woman I barely recognized. Gray hair pulled back in a messy bun, face lined with exhaustion and sorrow, shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. I looked defeated. I looked broken. I looked like someone who had given up on herself. Standing at my bathroom mirror that night, I forced myself to really look, to see what others saw when they looked at me. My reflection was harsh, unforgiving. When had I gotten so old? The woman staring back at me had deep lines bracketing her mouth, creases between her eyebrows from decades of worry, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. My hair, once a rich brown, was now completely gray, thin and brittle from stress and poor nutrition. My skin had a grayish tinge, the color of exhaustion and indoor fluorescent lights. I looked like someone who had survived something terrible, and I supposed I had. I had survived 50 years of putting myself last, of believing that self-sacrifice was the same as love, of disappearing piece by piece until almost nothing remained. But something stirred in me that night, something small but fierce. Anger. I felt angry for the first time in years, truly angry. Not the brief irritation that flares and fades, but a deep, burning anger at the injustice of it all. I had devoted my entire life to my children, and this was my reward? Exclusion? Dismissal. Being told I wasn't good enough for my own daughter's wedding? I pulled out my sewing basket, something I hadn't touched in months, and found the fabric I had hidden there. White lace and silk, expensive material I had saved for over a year to afford. I had been making Sarah's wedding dress in secret, working on it late at night when I couldn't sleep, pouring all my love into every stitch. I had imagined her face when I gave it to her, imagined her tears of joy, imagined her finally seeing how much I loved her. The fabric had cost me $300, an amount that represented months of sacrifice, skipped lunches, no coffee shop visits, walking instead of taking the bus, buying the cheapest of everything. I had purchased it from a specialty fabric store in Manhattan, taking the train there on my day off, spending hours comparing different materials, imagining how each would look on Sarah's frame. The salesperson had been kind, helping me choose, not judging my worn clothes or cheap purse. When I finally selected the lace and silk, I had felt a surge of joy so intense it brought tears to my eyes. This would be my gift to Sarah, my way of showing her how much I cherished her, how proud I was of the woman she'd become. The fabric sat in my sewing basket for weeks before I had the courage to begin. I was terrified of making a mistake, of ruining this expensive material, of disappointing Sarah with my amateur skills. But when I finally made the first cut, something magical happened. My hands remembered skills I had learned from my own mother, who had learned from hers, a lineage of women who created beauty from necessity, who made something from nothing, who poured love into every stitch. I worked on the dress late at night, after my shifts, when exhaustion should have made my hands clumsy. But touching the fabric energized me. Creating something beautiful gave me a sense of purpose beyond the endless grind of work and worry. I researched techniques online, watched YouTube tutorials, practiced complicated stitches on scrap fabric before applying them to the dress. Each evening, I would take out the dress, work for an hour or two, then carefully pack it away, hiding it in the back of my closet where Sarah wouldn't find it if she visited. I held the half-finished dress in my hands and wept. What a fool I had been. What a pathetic, desperate fool, thinking a dress could buy love, could earn respect, could make me worthy of inclusion in my own daughter's life. I almost threw it away that night, almost cut it to pieces in a rage. But something stopped me. Instead, I kept sewing. Not because I thought she would appreciate it, but because I needed to finish it for myself. I needed to prove to myself that I could create something beautiful even when my heart was breaking. I worked on that dress for 3 more weeks, perfecting every detail, adding delicate embroidery and tiny pearls, making it the most exquisite thing I had ever created. When it was finished, I folded it carefully and placed it in a box with a note that said simply, "For your wedding day. With all my love, Mom." The embroidery took the longest. I decided to add small flowers along the hem and sleeves, delicate roses and ivy that required hundreds of tiny stitches. My hands cramped, my eyes strained, but I kept going, driven by something I couldn't name. Grief, maybe, or defiance, or the desperate need to finish what I'd started. The pearls came last, sewn one by one along the neckline and down the back. I bought them from a craft store. Small, imperfect pearls that weren't real, but looked beautiful nonetheless. Each one took several stitches to secure properly. There were over 200 of them. My fingers bled from the needle pricks, tiny dots of red that I immediately washed out, terrified of staining the white fabric. The final product was breathtaking, better than anything I'd imagined when I started. It was a work of art, a testament to patience and skill and love. It deserved to be worn by someone who would appreciate it, someone who would understand the sacrifice it represented. I knew Sarah wouldn't understand, but I sent it anyway, because finishing it was about me, not her. It was about proving to myself that I could create beauty in the midst of heartbreak. I mailed the package to Sarah's apartment, then blocked her number. I couldn't bear to hear her reaction, whether it was gratitude or indifference or mockery. I didn't want to know. I just wanted it gone. Wanted that chapter of my life closed. But 2 weeks later, on what I knew was her wedding day, I couldn't help myself. I unblocked her number and looked at her social media, a masochistic impulse I immediately regretted. The photographs were everywhere. Sarah in her wedding dress, my dress, looking radiant and beautiful. She had altered it slightly, added a designer label to the tag so people would think she bought it from a famous boutique. In the photos, she posed with James, with Michael, with friends, with her new in-laws. I scrolled through dozens of pictures, searching for any mention of me, any acknowledgement of who made the dress she wore. Nothing. It was as if I didn't exist. But in one photograph, I saw something that made my breath catch. Sarah was dancing, her head thrown back in laughter, and for just a moment, the dress had shifted to reveal the inside seam. There, in my careful handwriting, I had embroidered a tiny message. Made with love by your mother, who will always cherish you. It was my secret, my small rebellion, my way of leaving a mark even if she never acknowledged me. I stared at that photograph for a long time, zooming in on those hidden words, feeling something crack open inside me. Not just pain anymore, but clarity. She wore the dress I made, accepted my labor and love, but didn't invite me to see her wear it. She took everything I had to give and gave nothing back. That night, I wrote Sarah a letter. Not an angry letter, not a guilt trip, but a simple, honest statement of truth. I wrote about the years of sacrifice, the love I poured into raising her, the dreams I had given up so she could pursue hers. I wrote about the pain of being excluded, the humiliation of being considered not good enough, the exhaustion of always giving and never receiving. I wrote about the dress, about the months of work, about the hope I had carried that it might bridge the distance between us. And I wrote about the decision I had made. I was done. Done trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Done sacrificing myself for people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Done waiting for crumbs of affection from children I had given everything. I sealed the letter and mailed it. Then I changed my phone number. Writing that letter took me 3 hours. I wrote draft after draft, each one angrier than the last, crossing out words, starting over, trying to find the right tone. I didn't want to be cruel, but I needed to be honest. I needed to say things I had never said, to break the silence that had suffocated me for years. In the final version, I told Sarah about the nights I went to bed hungry so she could have new clothes. I told her about the loans I was still paying off because of her shopping addiction. I told her about selling my mother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing I owned, to pay for her college textbooks. I told her about the morning after Tom's funeral, when I had to go to work because missing a shift meant losing rent money, how I changed bedpans and made beds while my heart was broken into pieces. I told her about the dreams I'd had for her, the hopes I'd carried, the vision I'd held of a daughter who might one day understand the depth of my love and reflect it back to me. I also wrote Michael a letter, shorter, but equally honest. I told him I was done covering his debts, done making excuses for his failures, done pretending his occasional text messages constituted a relationship. I told him I loved him, but could no longer participate in the dynamic we'd established, where he took and I gave, and we both pretended it was normal. I told him I hoped he'd find his way, that I'd always care about him, but that I needed to protect myself now, to save what little was left of me before I disappeared completely. Mailing both letters felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. My hands shook as I dropped them in the mailbox. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the blue metal, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. There was no going back now. I had burned the bridge, cut the cord, said the unsayable, and I felt, for the first time in years, a strange lightness, as if I'd been carrying a backpack full of stones and had finally set it down. The first few days were terrifying. I kept reaching for my phone to check messages that would never come, kept listening for a call that couldn't happen. But slowly, the terror transformed into something unexpected, relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting, wasn't hoping, wasn't trying to please people who couldn't be pleased. I started sleeping through the night, something I hadn't done since Tom died. I started eating regular meals instead of grabbing whatever was cheapest. I started taking walks in Prospect Park, watching the seasons change, feeling the sun on my face. Clara was delighted, insisting I'd join her for yoga classes and book clubs and weekend trips to small towns upstate. I protested at first, claiming I couldn't afford it, but Clara was relentless. "Margaret, you've been paying for everyone else's life for decades. It's time to invest in your own." The yoga classes were Clara's idea, and I resisted fiercely at first. "I'm 72 years old," I told her. "I can't bend like those young women in the magazines." Clara laughed. "It's a seniors class, Margaret. Everyone there is our age or older, and no one's bending into pretzels, I promise." She was right. The class met twice a week at the community center, a group of about 15 women ranging in age from 60 to 85. The instructor, a gentlewoman named Lisa, who was probably in her 50s, guided us through modified poses, emphasizing breath and mindfulness over flexibility. The first class was humbling. I discovered muscles I'd forgotten I had, felt stiffness in joints I'd been ignoring for years. But there was also something profoundly healing about it. For 1 hour, twice a week, I focused entirely on my breath, my body, the present moment. No worrying about bills or children or the past, just breathing, stretching, existing. She was right. I looked at my finances, something I had avoided for years because the numbers were too depressing. I was still repaying loans from Michael's business failures, still covering credit card debt Sarah had accumulated and abandoned. I was working full-time at 72, barely making ends meet, while my children lived in luxury. Michael worked in finance, earning 6 figures, yet he had never once offered to help with the debts I covered for him. Sarah's husband was wealthy, yet she had never offered to repay the thousands I had given her over the years. They took, and I gave, and somehow I was the one struggling while they prospered. It was obscene, it was unjust, and I was going to stop it. I made an appointment with a lawyer, a kind woman named Janet who specialized in elder financial abuse. I explained my situation, showed her bank statements and loan documents and emails where my children had promised to repay me and never did. Janet listened without judgment, then said something that changed my life. "Margaret, you've been financially exploited by your own family. What they've done is not just morally wrong, it's legally actionable. You have the right to stop supporting them and to demand repayment for what they owe you." The words hung in the air, legally actionable. As if the betrayal I felt was real, was valid, was something more than just my hurt feelings. Janet helped me draft letters to both Sarah and Michael, formal demands for repayment of the money they owed me, along with a statement that I would no longer be providing financial support of any kind. She also helped me freeze joint accounts and remove my children as beneficiaries on my life insurance policy. Janet's office was in a small building in downtown Brooklyn. Nothing fancy but professional and clean. She had photos of her own family on her desk: a husband, 2 adult children, grandchildren. I wondered if her family appreciated her, if her children called regularly, if she had the relationship with them that I'd always dreamed of having with mine. She must have noticed me staring at the photos because she said, "Relationships take work from both sides. You can't force someone to value you, but you can protect yourself from their indifference." Her directness was refreshing after years of tiptoeing around the truth. She laid out my options clearly, explained the legal process, estimated costs and timelines. She also warned me about the emotional toll. "Your children are going to push back hard," she said. "They're going to try every manipulation tactic they know. They'll be angry, then sad, then remorseful, then threatening. It's a predictable cycle. You need to be prepared for that and decide now whether you can hold your boundaries when they start applying pressure." I thought about her question for a long time. Could I hold my boundaries? Could I withstand Sarah's tears, Michael's anger, their accusations that I was being a terrible mother? I wasn't sure, but I knew that if I didn't try, if I continued down the same path, I would die in a few years having lived entirely for people who never really saw me. That thought was unbearable. So I nodded and said, "I can do it. I have to do it." Janet smiled, a sad but proud smile. "Good. You deserve better than what they've given you. And sometimes claiming that better life means disappointing people who've grown comfortable with your suffering." Sending those letters was one of the hardest things I ever did. My hands shook as I signed them, my heart pounding with fear and guilt. What kind of mother sues her own children for money? What kind of mother cuts off her family? But then I remembered Clara's words. "You're not cutting them off. They cut you off a long time ago. You're just finally acknowledging it." I mailed the letters on a Monday morning, then went to work as usual, my stomach churning with anxiety. I didn't have to wait long for a response. Michael called the lawyer's office within hours, furious and threatening. Sarah sent a barrage of text messages to my old number, messages I only saw later when Clara showed them to me. Both were outraged, offended, disbelieving. How dare I demand money from them? How dare I threaten legal action? After everything they had done for me, this was how I repaid them? Everything they had done for me. The phrase was so absurd I almost laughed. What exactly had they done for me? Michael had borrowed money he never repaid, involved me in financial schemes that cost me thousands, and called me maybe twice a year unless he needed something. Sarah had stolen from me, lied to me, excluded me from her life, and taken my labor without acknowledgement. Yet somehow, in their minds, I was the ungrateful one. I was the villain in this story. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. But I had spent enough years in therapy support groups at the hospital to recognize narcissistic patterns when I saw them. My children had been raised to believe the world revolved around them, that my purpose was to serve their needs, that my worth was measured by my usefulness. And I had reinforced those beliefs every time I sacrificed my needs for theirs, every time I forgave their cruelty, every time I accepted their excuses. Janet advised me not to respond to their messages, to let the legal process unfold. "They're going to try to manipulate you emotionally," she warned. "They'll cycle through anger, then guilt-tripping, then false promises, then threats. Don't engage. Stay strong." She was right. Over the next few weeks, both Michael and Sarah went through predictable stages. First came the anger. Voice messages calling me selfish, ungrateful, a terrible mother. Then came the guilt trips. Emails reminding me of times they had been kind to me, of gifts they had given me, of how hurt they were by my betrayal. Then came the false promises. Texts swearing they would pay me back immediately if I just dropped the legal action. And finally came the threats. Warnings that I would never see my grandchildren, that they would tell the whole family how horrible I was, that I would die alone and regretted. Each message was designed to break me, to make me doubt myself, to pull me back into the old pattern of giving and forgiving. But I didn't break. I read each message once, felt the sting, and then let it go. Clara helped, reminding me constantly of my worth, of the justice in what I was doing. The hospital social worker helped, validating my feelings and encouraging my boundaries. Even some of my coworkers helped, sharing their own stories of family exploitation and expressing admiration for my courage. Slowly, I began to see myself not as a bad mother, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity. I began to see my children not as victims of my cruelty, but as adults responsible for their own choices and consequences. I began to see the situation clearly for the first time in decades. The hospital social worker, Gloria, became an unexpected source of support. She'd worked at the hospital for 30 years, about as long as I had, and we'd known each other casually, but never been close. One day, she found me crying in the supply closet during my break, overwhelmed by a particularly vicious voice message from Michael. Instead of offering empty platitudes, she said, "Come to my office. We need to talk." In her cramped office, filled with resource pamphlets and inspirational posters, Gloria told me her own story. She'd cut off contact with her abusive brother 10 years ago, and her family had ostracized her for it. "Everyone kept telling me that family is family, that I should forgive, that blood is thicker than water," she said. But you know what? That phrase is actually misquoted. The original saying is, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb," which means the opposite. Chosen relationships are stronger than biological ones. You get to choose who's in your life, Margaret. And you're not required to keep toxic people around just because you share DNA. 3 months after sending the letters, Janet called with news. "Michael has agreed to a payment plan for what he owes you. It's not the full amount, but it's a start. He'll be sending monthly payments for the next 5 years." I felt a surge of vindication, followed quickly by sadness. He could have paid me back at any time. He chose not to, until forced by legal action. Sarah, on the other hand, refused to negotiate. She claimed she owed me nothing, that everything I had given her was a gift freely given, that I had no right to demand repayment. Janet explained that legally, this was a gray area. Much of what I had given Sarah had been framed as gifts, making it difficult to prove they were loans. We could continue fighting, take her to court, but the emotional and financial cost would be high. I decided to let it go. Not because I forgave her, but because I didn't want to spend any more of my energy on someone who saw me as disposable. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. With Michael's monthly payments, I was able to pay off some of my debt. I cut my hours at the hospital from full-time to part-time, giving myself room to breathe for the first time in decades. I started taking the yoga classes with Clara, discovering muscles I had forgotten I had and a flexibility I didn't know I possessed. I joined a book club at the local library, discussing novels and memoirs with other women my age, many of whom shared similar stories of family exploitation. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone, except in my own head where I had convinced myself that sacrificing everything for my children was noble rather than self-destructive. I also started therapy, something I had resisted for years because it felt self-indulgent. My therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, was patient and insightful, helping me untangle decades of codependency and people-pleasing. "Margaret, you spent your whole life trying to earn love through sacrifice," she said during one session. "But love that must be earned isn't love. It's a transaction. And you've been on the losing end of that transaction for a very long time." Her words struck me deeply. I had believed that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, proved myself enough, my children would love me. But their love had always been conditional, dependent on what I could provide. The moment I stopped providing, the moment I set boundaries, they discarded me. That wasn't love. That was exploitation dressed up in the language of family obligation. Dr. Rodriguez's office became my sanctuary. Located in a converted brownstone in Park Slope, it had large windows that let in natural light, plants everywhere, comfortable chairs that didn't feel clinical. Our sessions were every Wednesday afternoon, and I found myself looking forward to them with an intensity that surprised me. For 1 hour each week, I had someone's complete attention, someone who listened without judgment, who validated my feelings without trying to fix me. Dr. Rodriguez had a gentle but direct approach that pushed me to examine beliefs I'd held for decades. In one session, she asked me to list the qualities I admired in other people. I talked about kindness, generosity, integrity, resilience. Then she asked me to describe myself. I struggled, finally managing words like tired, used, foolish. She leaned forward and said, "Margaret, you just described yourself with other people's judgments. Now describe yourself with your own words, the way you'd describe a friend you loved." I couldn't do it. I cried instead, realizing I had no idea who I was outside of my role as mother, nurse, caretaker, giver. Over many sessions, Dr. Rodriguez helped me excavate my identity from under decades of self-negation. She gave me homework assignments, writing exercises, self-care activities, experiments in boundary setting. One week, she asked me to do something purely for my own pleasure, something I wouldn't have to justify to anyone. I agonized over this simple task, my mind immediately generating excuses for why I couldn't spend money or time on myself. Finally, I went to a museum, something I'd always loved but never made time for. I spent 3 hours wandering through galleries, looking at paintings, reading placards, sitting on benches just absorbing beauty. I cried in front of a Monet, overwhelmed by color and light, and the realization that I'd denied myself simple joys for so long I'd forgotten they existed. When I told Dr. Rodriguez about this in our next session, she smiled and said, "That's the Margaret I want you to know, the woman who cries at Monet paintings. The woman who deserves beauty and joy and time." 6 months after cutting contact, something unexpected happened. I received a friend request on Facebook from someone named Emma. The profile picture showed a young woman in her mid-20s with Sarah's eyes and Michael's smile. My granddaughter. I had never met her. Sarah had gotten pregnant during college and had kept me at arm's length throughout the pregnancy and birth, feeding me occasional photos but never inviting me to visit. I accepted the request with trembling hands, my heart pounding. Emma sent a message almost immediately. "Hi, Grandma. I know you and my mom aren't talking, but I wanted to reach out. I've seen some of the things that happened, and I don't think it's fair. I'd like to get to know you if you're open to it. I sat staring at that message for a long time, tears streaming down my face. Someone in my family saw me. Someone in my family thought I mattered. We started messaging regularly, tentative at first, then with growing warmth. Emma told me about her life. She was studying nursing, ironically, at the same hospital where I had worked for 30 years. She told me about her frustrations with her mother's materialism and superficiality, about feeling like she didn't fit into the wealthy, status-obsessed world Sarah and James inhabited. She told me she had found the box where Sarah kept my letters and old photographs, had read about my life and sacrifices, and had felt a connection to a grandmother she had never been allowed to know. "My mom always said you were difficult and dramatic," Emma wrote. "But reading your letters, you just sound like someone who loved us and got hurt. I'm sorry you were treated that way." Meeting Emma in person was terrifying and wonderful. We agreed to have coffee at a small cafe in Brooklyn, neutral territory where we could both feel safe. I arrived early, my heart racing, and waited at a corner table by the window. When Emma walked in, I recognized her immediately. She looked so much like Sarah at that age, but there was a warmth in her expression that Sarah had lost somewhere along the way. We hugged awkwardly at first, then sat down and talked for 3 hours. She asked about my life, about Tom, about what it was like raising Sarah and Michael. I asked about her studies, her dreams, her relationship with her mother. We were honest with each other in a way I had never been able to be with my own children. Emma acknowledged that Sarah was difficult, that she prioritized image over substance, that she had hurt a lot of people. But she also said, "You deserved better, Grandma. You deserved so much better." That first meeting with Emma felt like being given a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever. Family connection based on genuine affection rather than obligation. Emma asked questions about my life that no one else had ever asked. She wanted to know about my childhood, about how I met Tom, about what my dreams had been before children, about the person I was underneath the role of mother. I found myself sharing stories I'd forgotten I had, about wanting to be a teacher when I was young, about loving to read poetry, about the summer I spent painting watercolors before life got too busy for hobbies. Emma listened with rapt attention, making me feel like my history mattered, like I was interesting beyond my usefulness. She also shared things about her own life with a vulnerability that touched me deeply. She talked about feeling pressure from Sarah to pursue corporate success, when what she really wanted was to help people. She talked about witnessing her parents' marriage dissolve and feeling relieved more than sad because the pretense had been exhausting. She talked about finding my letters and feeling angry on my behalf, angry at a mother who could be so cruel to someone who had given so much. Through Emma, I learned details about Sarah's wedding that made the betrayal even clearer. The wedding hadn't been small at all. It had been a lavish affair with over 200 guests. The claim that it was intimate had been a lie, an excuse to justify excluding me without admitting the real reason. Sarah was ashamed of me, ashamed of my modest apartment, my working-class background, my simple clothes and lack of sophistication. James's family was old money, the kind of wealth that spans generations and comes with expectations of pedigree. Sarah wanted to fit into that world, and I didn't fit the image she was trying to project. So she erased me, made me disappear, wore the dress I made but told everyone it was designer, accepting compliments without ever mentioning the woman who had sewn every stitch with love. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but at least now I understood. It wasn't about me being difficult or dramatic. It was about her being ashamed. Emma became a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. We started meeting regularly, for coffee, for walks in the park, for dinners at my apartment where I cooked the simple, hearty meals Sarah had always scorned. Emma appreciated my cooking, appreciated the stories I shared, appreciated me in a way my own children never had. She even visited me at work one day, surprising me during my shift, and the pride I felt introducing her to my coworkers was overwhelming. This was my granddaughter. This beautiful, kind, intelligent young woman was my family, and she chose to know me despite the obstacles her mother had erected. Through Emma, I also learned that Sarah's marriage was troubled. James was controlling and critical, constantly comparing Sarah to other women and demanding she maintain a certain image. The wealth came with strings, and Sarah was trapped in a golden cage of her own making. I felt no satisfaction in learning this. I didn't want Sarah to be unhappy, even after everything she had done. I wanted her to be whole, to be loved, to be free. But I also recognized that her choices had consequences, that the shallow, status-obsessed life she had chosen came with its own forms of suffering. And I couldn't save her from those consequences. I had spent too many years trying to save my children from themselves, and it had cost me everything. Now, I was learning to save myself instead. I was learning that I could be a good person, a loving person, without sacrificing my well-being for people who didn't value it. I was learning that boundaries weren't cruel. They were necessary. I was learning that my worth wasn't determined by how much I gave, but by who I was. 1 year after cutting contact with Sarah and Michael, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I was going to quit my job and travel. For 50 years, I had worked without stopping. I had never taken a real vacation, never indulged in anything frivolous, never prioritized my own happiness. I had always told myself I couldn't afford it, that my children needed the money more, that there would be time later. But there might not be time later. I was 73, and my body was starting to show the wear of decades of labor. My knees ached, my back hurt, my hands were stiff from arthritis. If I didn't do this now, I might never get the chance. So I gave my notice at the hospital, using the small amount of savings I had managed to accumulate, along with Michael's payments, to fund a trip I had dreamed about since I was young. Giving notice at the hospital was emotional in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd worked there for 30 years, longer than most marriages last. The place had its own geography in my mind. I could walk the halls blindfolded, knew which elevator was slowest, which bathroom had the best water pressure, which vending machine was most reliable. I knew the weekend supervisor who brought homemade tamales, the night shift custodian who hummed old R&B songs, the ER doctor who remembered everyone's birthday. These people had been my extended family when my actual family was absent. When I submitted my resignation, my supervisor insisted on throwing me a small party. They brought cake and made speeches about my dedication and kindness. Several coworkers cried, including Maria, who had witnessed so many of my difficult moments with my children. "You deserve this," she whispered, hugging me tight. "Go see the world. Be happy." Their genuine affection humbled me, made me realize I'd built a community here without even noticing. Connections based on mutual respect and shared experience rather than blood obligation. I bought a train ticket to Chicago, then to Denver, then to San Francisco. I had never been west of Pennsylvania in my entire life, and now I was going to see mountains and deserts and the Pacific Ocean. Clara was thrilled, helping me pack and plan, insisting I send her photos from every stop. Emma was excited too, promising to visit me in San Francisco if I stayed there long enough. Even Dr. Rodriguez was supportive, calling my decision a profound act of self-love. The night before I left, I stood in my apartment looking at the life I had built. The worn furniture, the faded curtains, the photographs of a family that no longer existed. I felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of liberation. This place had been my prison for decades, and now I was breaking free. The train ride to Chicago was magical. I sat by the window, watching the landscape change from urban to rural, from autumn to early winter, feeling the rhythm of the rails beneath me. I struck up conversations with other passengers, sharing stories and laughter, feeling connected to humanity in a way I hadn't in years. In Chicago, I visited art museums and jazz clubs, experiencing culture I had only read about. I walked along Lake Michigan, feeling the wind on my face, tasting the freedom in every breath. In Denver, I saw mountains for the first time, their snow-capped peaks rising against impossibly blue skies, and I wept at their beauty. In San Francisco, I walked across the Golden Gate Bridge, looked out at the endless ocean, and felt small and infinite all at once. Chicago surprised me with its energy and diversity. I stayed in a small hostel in a neighborhood called Pilsen, full of vibrant murals and Mexican restaurants. The hostel was mostly young people, backpackers in their 20s, and I worried I'd feel out of place. But they welcomed me warmly, curious about this older woman traveling alone. I met a young woman from Germany who was biking across America, a couple from Australia hiking the national parks, a man from Japan documenting street art. We cooked together in the shared kitchen, swapped travel stories, gave each other recommendations. They treated me as an equal, a fellow traveler, not as someone's grandmother or someone to be pitied. One evening, a group of us went to a jazz club in the South Loop, a dark, intimate space where a saxophonist played music that seemed to speak directly to my soul. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, felt tears streaming down my face, felt something that might have been joy. Denver was different, quieter, more contemplative. I took a bus tour into the Rocky Mountains, stood at a lookout point where I could see peaks stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thin and cold, smelling of pine and snow. I felt overwhelmed by the scale of it, by my own smallness in the face of such majesty. A park ranger gave a talk about the geology, about how these mountains had formed millions of years ago through unimaginable pressure and heat, earth pushing against earth, creating beauty through violence. I thought about my own life, about the pressure and heat that had formed me, about how pain could create its own kind of beauty if you survived it. I hiked a short trail, my knees protesting but my spirit soaring, and sat on a boulder eating a sandwich I'd packed, watching clouds move across the sky, feeling more at peace than I had in decades. San Francisco stole my heart. The city was everything I'd imagined and more. Steep hills and colorful houses, fog rolling in off the bay, diversity and creativity everywhere. I found a studio apartment to rent in the Sunset District, a neighborhood near the ocean where Asian groceries sat next to Irish pubs, and the fog was so thick some mornings you couldn't see across the street. My apartment was tiny, just a room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it had a window with a sliver of ocean view if you stood in just the right spot. I furnished it simply with items from thrift stores and felt an absurd pride in this small space that was entirely mine, chosen by me, reflecting my taste, rather than accumulated through decades of making do. Emma did visit me in San Francisco, flying out for a long weekend. We explored the city together, riding cable cars, eating dim sum in Chinatown, watching sea lions at Fisherman's Wharf. On our last night, we sat on the beach watching the sunset, and Emma said, "Grandma, I'm so proud of you. You could have stayed bitter and angry, but instead, you chose joy. You chose yourself. That takes incredible strength." I hugged her, tears streaming down my face, feeling a fullness in my heart I hadn't known was possible. This was what family should be, not obligation and guilt, but genuine affection and mutual respect. This was what I had been searching for all along, and I had found it not with the children I raised, but with the grandchild I barely knew. Our last evening together, Emma and I walked along Ocean Beach, shoes off, feet in the cold Pacific water. The sun was setting in shades of orange and pink, and the beach was relatively empty except for a few surfers and dog walkers. Emma asked me if I was happy, really happy, or just pretending to be okay. I thought about the question seriously before answering. "I'm not pretending," I told her. "I'm genuinely happier now than I've been in years. But it's complicated. I still grieve for the relationship I wanted with your mother, for the family I dreamed of having. I still have moments where I doubt myself, where I wonder if I'm selfish or cruel. But mostly, I feel free, like I've been holding my breath for 50 years and finally exhaled. Emma squeezed my hand. "I think that's what real happiness is," she said. "Not the absence of pain, but the presence of freedom." Her wisdom, at 25, astounded me. She was so much wiser than I'd been at her age, so much clearer about boundaries and self-worth. I hoped she'd never have to learn the hard lessons I'd learned, never have to choose between herself and the people she loved. I stayed in San Francisco for 3 months, renting a small studio apartment in the Sunset District. I volunteered at a community clinic, using my nursing skills to help people who couldn't afford health care. I took watercolor painting classes, discovering a talent I didn't know I had. I joined a seniors hiking group, exploring trails in Marin County and along the coast. I made friends, real friends who knew nothing about my past, who liked me for who I was now, not for what I could provide. I even went on a few dates with a kind widower named Henry, who made me laugh and never once asked me for money or favors. We didn't become a couple, but the experience of being seen as a woman rather than just a mother or grandmother was healing in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The watercolor classes were held in a bright studio in the Mission District, taught by an artist named Paulo who had wild gray hair and paint-stained clothes and spoke about art with infectious enthusiasm. I'd never considered myself creative, had always thought art was for other people with talent and training and time. But Paulo insisted that everyone could paint, that art wasn't about creating masterpieces, but about seeing the world and expressing what you saw. We started with basic techniques, washes, wet on wet, layering colors. My first attempts were terrible, muddy, and shapeless. But Paulo circled the room offering encouragement, and gradually I began to see improvement. I painted San Francisco scenes, the Golden Gate Bridge emerging from fog, Victorian houses in sherbet colors, the ocean at sunset. My paintings would never hang in museums, but they were mine, proof that I could create something, that I had a perspective worth expressing. The seniors hiking group met every Saturday morning, a collection of about 12 people ranging in age from 60 to 80, led by an energetic woman named Ruth, who was 76 and could out-hike people half her age. We explored trails all over the Bay Area, through redwood forests where trees older than nations reached toward the sky, along coastal bluffs where the Pacific crashed against rocks, up mountains where the views stretched for miles. My knees hurt, my breath came short on uphill sections, but I kept going, pushed by the group's encouragement and my own stubborn determination. After hikes, we'd gather at coffee shops or diners, sharing stories and laughter, forging friendships based on shared experience rather than history. These people knew nothing about my children, my failed relationships, my decades of sacrifice. They knew only that I was Margaret, the woman who painted watercolors and made terrible jokes and always brought homemade cookies to share. Henry appeared in my life during my second month in San Francisco. We met at a community potluck at the Sunset Community Center, both of us standing awkwardly on the periphery of social groups that seemed already formed. He introduced himself, asked if I was new to the neighborhood, and we started talking. He was 75, a retired high school history teacher who'd been widowed 5 years earlier. His wife had died of cancer, a long, slow decline that he'd witnessed with helpless devotion. He spoke about her with love, but without the crushing grief that had defined my early years without Tom. He'd done his mourning, had emerged on the other side, was ready to live again. We started meeting for coffee, then for walks, then for dinners. He was kind and funny, interested in my life without needing to fix or save me. We went to movies, visited museums, explored neighborhoods. One evening, he kissed me, hesitantly, sweetly, and I kissed him back, surprised by my own desire, by the realization that my body still knew how to want, to respond, to feel pleasure. We didn't fall in love. I don't think either of us wanted that kind of intensity at our age. But we enjoyed each other, found comfort in companionship, reminded each other that life could still hold surprises. During those months, Sarah tried to contact me several times. She got my new number from Emma. Though Emma swore she didn't give it willingly, Sarah had apparently pressured and guilt-tripped her until she caved. The messages started apologetic. "Mom, I'm sorry for how things went down. I'd like to talk." I didn't respond. Then they became angry. "You're being childish. This grudge is ridiculous. I'm your daughter. You're supposed to forgive me." I still didn't respond. Finally, they became manipulative. "Mom, I need you. My marriage is falling apart. James is leaving me. I have nowhere to go. Please help me." That message gave me pause. Part of me, the old part, the part that had spent 70 years trying to fix everyone's problems, wanted to respond, wanted to save her. But I talked to Dr. Rodriguez first, and she reminded me of a crucial truth. "Margaret, Sarah isn't asking for emotional support. She's asking for rescue. And rescuing her would mean stepping back into the pattern that destroyed you. You can't save her from the consequences of her choices." She was right. If I responded now, if I let Sarah back in, nothing would change. She would take what she needed, then push me away again once the crisis passed. I had seen this pattern too many times to fall for it again, so I didn't respond. Instead, I sent a brief message through Emma. "I hope you find the help you need, but I can't be that help. I wish you well." It felt cruel to say, but it was also honest. I did wish her well. I wanted her to be happy and healthy, but I couldn't sacrifice myself to make that happen. She was an adult, responsible for her own life, and I had spent enough years trying to live it for her. Michael's response to my new life was different. He never apologized, never acknowledged wrongdoing, but his monthly payments continued reliably, and occasionally he would send a brief text. "Hope you're doing well. Saw you're in San Francisco. Looks nice." It wasn't much, but it was more than Sarah offered, and I took it for what it was, a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps he had been wrong about some things. I didn't reach out to him either. If he wanted a relationship, he would have to put in the effort. I was done doing all the emotional labor. After 6 months of traveling, I returned to Brooklyn, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. My apartment felt different now, not like a prison, but like a home base, a place to rest between adventures. I had changed during my time away. I walked taller, smiled more easily, felt lighter. People noticed. Clara said I looked 10 years younger. Dr. Rodriguez said I had finally stepped into my authentic self. Emma said I glowed with happiness, and I felt it, a deep, abiding sense of peace that came from knowing I had chosen myself, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, the world had expanded. Returning to Brooklyn was surreal. The neighborhood looked the same bodega on the corner, same crack in the sidewalk I always stepped over, same smell of bread from the bakery. But I saw it differently now, with eyes that had witnessed mountains and oceans and sunsets over the Pacific. My apartment, which had felt so confining before I left, now felt cozy, manageable. Mine in a way it hadn't before. I spent a week cleaning and reorganizing, getting rid of things I no longer needed, old clothes that no longer fit my life, knickknacks with no meaning, photographs that brought more pain than joy. I kept the good memories, the images of my children when they were young and we were happy, but I put them in a box rather than displaying them on walls. The past deserved acknowledgement, but not dominance. I started a blog, writing about my experiences traveling as a senior woman, about healing from family estrangement, about learning self-worth late in life. I didn't expect anyone to read it, but the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women, and some men, reached out to share their own stories of family exploitation, of sacrificing everything for children who didn't appreciate it, of finally setting boundaries and reclaiming their lives. We formed an online community, supporting each other through the guilt and grief that comes with choosing ourselves over toxic family members. I realized I wasn't just healing myself, I was helping others heal too. my pain, my journey, had meaning beyond my own life. The blog became an unexpected source of purpose and connection. I wrote posts about specific experiences: the terror of changing my phone number, the grief of missing Sarah's wedding, the joy of seeing mountains for the first time, the complicated feelings about Emma reaching out. I wrote about practical matters too: how to find affordable therapy, how to document financial exploitation, how to respond when family members accused you of being selfish. The comment section became a virtual support group where people shared their stories, offered encouragement, asked for advice. Some readers were in situations similar to mine: elderly parents rejected by adult children. Others were adult children who'd been forced to cut off toxic parents. Still others were somewhere in the middle, trying to navigate complicated family dynamics while preserving their own well-being. What united us was the recognition that family relationships could be sources of tremendous pain, and that sometimes the healthiest choice was to step away. I started doing video calls with some of my blog readers, informal conversations where we'd talk about our experiences and strategies for healing. These calls were raw and real, full of tears and laughter, grief and hope. I met Susan, a 68-year-old woman in Oregon who'd been financially exploited by her son for decades and was finally setting boundaries. I met David, a 55-year-old man in Texas who'd cut off his narcissistic parents and was working through complex grief and guilt. I met Lynn, a 74-year-old woman in California who'd been excluded from her grandchildren's lives and was building a new family through community connections. These people became my friends, my tribe, proof that family could be chosen as well as given, that blood wasn't the only thing that bonded people together. 2 years after Sarah's wedding, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Sarah and a check for $15,000, a partial repayment of what she owed me. The letter was long and rambling, filled with apologies and explanations. She wrote about her divorce from James, about the financial and emotional abuse she had endured, about the therapy she was now in, about the ways she was trying to become a better person. She wrote about the dress, about finally acknowledging that I had made it, about the shame she felt for erasing me from her wedding. She wrote about Emma, about how seeing our relationship had forced her to confront her own failures as a daughter. And she wrote about wanting to try again, to rebuild our relationship if I was willing. I read the letter 3 times, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions: relief that she was safe and getting help, sadness for the years we had lost, anger that it had taken her losing everything to finally see me as human, and caution, deep, bone-level caution born of experience. I wanted to believe she had changed, but I also knew that people rarely transform overnight. I wrote back, a brief note thanking her for the money and acknowledging her apology, but I didn't make any promises. I told her I needed time, that rebuilding trust would be a slow process, that I couldn't go back to being the mother who gave everything and asked nothing in return. I told her that if we were going to have a relationship, it would have to be between equals, with mutual respect and genuine care. And I told her I would know within the first few interactions whether she was serious about changing or just trying to manipulate me back into the old pattern. We started exchanging emails, tentative and formal at first. Sarah told me about her life post-divorce. She had moved into a smaller apartment, gone back to school for a degree in social work, started volunteering at a women's shelter. She was working through her own issues with materialism and status, recognizing how those values had poisoned her relationships. She asked about my travels, about my blog, about my life with genuine curiosity, rather than the dismissive politeness she used to display. Slowly, cautiously, we began to build something new. It wasn't the relationship I had dreamed of when she was young. It would never be that innocent or unconditional again. But it was real, and that mattered. The first phone call with Sarah, about a month into our email exchange, was awkward and emotional. Long silences punctuated by careful words, both of us testing boundaries, trying to figure out how to talk to each other. She cried, apologizing again for the wedding, for the years of taking me for granted, for not seeing me as a person with my own needs and feelings. I cried too, grieving for the time we'd lost, for the mother-daughter relationship that might have been. But I also held firm to my boundaries. When she asked if she could visit, I said not yet. When she suggested I might want to help her with some expenses related to school, I said no, that she needed to be financially independent if we were going to have a healthy relationship. She accepted these boundaries, didn't push or guilt trip, and that acceptance meant more than any apology. Our relationship rebuilt slowly over the following year. Phone calls became more frequent and less strained. We met for coffee once, a brief meeting at a cafe halfway between her apartment and mine, both of us nervous. We talked about surface things mostly, her classes, my blog, the weather. But there were moments of deeper connection, moments where I saw glimpses of the daughter I'd loved, the person she might have been without the corrosive influence of status and wealth. She told me about her volunteer work at the women's shelter, about hearing stories from women who'd been exploited and abused and suddenly recognizing her own behavior in the stories. "I did that to you," she said quietly. "I took and never saw you as human. I'm so sorry, Mom." I squeezed her hand across the table, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Forgiveness would take more time, more proof of change, but it was acknowledgement, and that was a start. Now, 3 years after that painful text message, I'm sitting in my Brooklyn apartment on a Sunday morning, drinking good coffee, the expensive kind I can now afford, and reflecting on everything that's happened. Emma is visiting this afternoon, bringing her new boyfriend for me to meet. Sarah and I have plans to have dinner next week, something we do once a month now. Careful conversations where we're both learning to be honest without being cruel. Michael sends occasional texts, and we've had a few awkward phone calls where he almost but not quite apologizes for his past behavior. It's not perfect, but it's progress. More importantly, I've learned to build a life that doesn't revolve around my children. I volunteer at the clinic twice a week. I paint watercolors and sell them at local art fairs. I write my blog and facilitate online support groups. I travel, not as extensively as during that first trip, but I take small trips regularly, exploring new places and meeting new people. I've learned to say no without guilt, to prioritize my needs without shame, to recognize my own worth regardless of how others treat me. I've learned that being a good mother doesn't mean being a martyr, that love shouldn't require self-destruction, that I can be generous without being exploited. The art fairs have become a surprising source of joy and income. I set up a small booth at neighborhood markets, displaying my watercolors, chatting with people who stop to look. Some pieces sell, bringing in money that feels earned rather than sacrificed. But more than the income, I treasure the conversations with strangers who see my work and respond to it, who ask about my process, who share their own stories. One woman bought a painting of the Golden Gate Bridge and told me she'd grown up in San Francisco, but hadn't been back in 30 years due to family estrangement. "This reminds me of what I loved about the city," she said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for capturing it." These moments of connection, stranger to stranger, artist to viewer, remind me that I have something to offer the world beyond maternal sacrifice. The dress, that beautiful, heartbreaking symbol of everything I gave and everything I lost, is hanging in my closet now. Sarah returned it to me last year, carefully cleaned and preserved, along with a note that said, "This should have always been yours. Thank you for making it. Thank you for everything." I don't know what I'll do with it. Maybe I'll donate it to a museum or a vintage clothing store. Maybe I'll keep it as a reminder of who I was and who I've become. Maybe I'll alter it into something new, something that fits my life now. But whatever I decide, it will be my choice, my decision, my way of honoring the woman who sewed that dress with such hope and love. Sometimes I take the dress out of the closet and look at it, running my fingers over the lace and silk, tracing the embroidered flowers, touching each pearl. It's still beautiful. Perhaps more beautiful now because I can see it clearly, without the fog of desperate hope that clouded my vision when I made it. The workmanship is excellent. Professional level, really. I'm proud of what I created, proud of the skill and patience it required. But I'm also able now to see the dress for what it was. An attempt to buy love through labor, to prove my worth through sacrifice, to create connection through giving when the other person wasn't interested in receiving. The dress is beautiful, but it couldn't fix what was broken. No amount of perfect stitches could bridge the gap between us when Sarah didn't want the bridge to exist. Looking back on everything, I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I had set boundaries earlier, if I had valued myself sooner. But I try not to dwell on regrets. Every experience, even the painful ones, brought me to this moment, sitting in the morning sun, feeling content and whole, knowing that I am enough exactly as I am. I survived decades of being treated as dispensable, and I emerged not bitter, but stronger. I learned that liberation isn't selfish, it's necessary. I learned that my children's happiness isn't my responsibility, but my own happiness is. I learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, to reclaim your dignity, to build a life worth living. To anyone reading this who sees themselves in my story, who feels overworked and undervalued by the people they love most, I want you to know, you deserve better. You deserve to be loved not for what you provide, but for who you are. You deserve respect, appreciation, genuine care. And if the people in your life can't or won't give you those things, it's okay to walk away. It's okay to protect yourself. It's okay to choose your own peace over their expectations. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. You matter. Your feelings matter. Your well-being matters. And reclaiming your life isn't selfish. It's survival. Have you experienced something similar? Have you loved someone who took everything and gave nothing back? Have you rebuilt your life after family betrayal? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this narrative resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we can create a community where people feel seen, heard, and supported as they journey toward healing and wholeness. You are not alone. You never were.